Today, I'm delivering the 2026-27 Biennial Revenue Estimate, or BRE, to guide the 89th Legislature in writing the state budget. This is my duty under the Texas Constitution. It's a serious responsibility because the funding available for state initiatives affects Texans' wallets and the quality of their lives. Thanks to those hardworking Texas taxpayers and the state leaders and lawmakers who set policy and make spending decisions, Texas is in good financial shape. I expect revenues to grow through the next biennium, although at a more moderated pace than historical levels, and certainly by much less than the surge we experienced after the lifting of pandemic restrictions. I am not projecting a recession, and the state has money in the bank. Lawmakers writing the 2026-27 budget will have a large cash balance carried forward from the current biennium. But the projected ending balance in this BRE comes from different sources than the huge balance of 2 years ago, and it reflects the fact that lawmakers didn't spend all of the available funds in 2023. This was a wise move, as was their decision to limit future costs when making a number of large investments in the current budget. One-time expenditures don't create a continuing pull on state funds. It's also necessary to note that the BRE projections are inevitably affected by events outside of our control. Texas isn't immune to the threats that come with global uncertainty. War and unrest in other countries affect our security and puts our supply chain at risk of disruption. Here at home, even though the inflation rate is slowing, it will take time and strong leadership to address the continued damaging effect of record levels of inflation. Thoughtful consideration of spending decisions, as always, will be crucial to ensure new and existing investments can be funded in the future, and that these investments focus on improving the lives of Texans. Despite positive economic numbers, many of our residents are feeling the higher cost of groceries, housing, and other basic necessities, and many are struggling to ensure a bright future for their children. Texas lawmakers will have an estimated $194.6 billion available for general purpose spending in the 2026-27 biennium, a decrease of 1.1% from the corresponding amounts of the funds for 2024-25. The total includes an ending balance of $23.76 billion from the current 2-year budget period, which ends August 31, plus 2026-27 tax revenues of $155.4 billion and non-tax receipts of $21 billion. Of this total, we must reserve $5.6 billion from oil and natural gas tax collections for transfers to the State Highway Fund to support our transportation system as required by the Texas Constitution. We typically would set aside a similar portion of oil and gas tax revenues for the Economic Stabilization Fund, or ESF, the rainy day fund, but we're not going to do that this time because the ESF balance will exceed its cap from the start of the biennium. In addition to general revenue-related funds, I expect the state to receive $115 billion in federal income, along with $70.7 billion in other revenues that are dedicated for specific purposes and therefore unavailable for general purpose spending. Revenue collections from all sources and for all purposes will total a projected $362.2 billion. The $23.76 billion projected ending balance for the 2024-25 is robust, but it differs in meaningful ways from the record-shattering ending projected balance in the BRE of 2 years ago. The previous ending balance reflected astonishing state revenue growth coming out of the pandemic-related shutdowns, skyrocketing inflation, and the influx of federal money. It allowed lawmakers to make critical investments in infrastructure, including broadband, water, higher education, and parks, as well as provide significant property tax relief while maintaining a balanced budget that left money on the table for 2026-27. The projected ending balance in this BRE has a different makeup. It reflects conservative fiscal management practices and spending decisions. Other states that reported big balances now are experiencing deficits. It includes unspent contingent appropriations of $4.5 billion for public education and education savings accounts because the 88th legislature didn't enact the required legislation. In addition, a full $7.33 billion of the balance is due to general revenue dedicated accounts. This is money that has been collected for specific purposes but hasn't been spent, allowing it to be considered when certifying the budget as balanced. This estimated ending balance does not account for any general revenue related spending that may be authorized through a supplemental appropriations bill. Additional spending would, of course, reduce the funds available. The final ending balance for 2024-25 will be determined by the actions of the 89th legislature and by actual revenue collections during the remainder of this fiscal year. I project state tax collections that soared after the easing of COVID-related constraints in fiscal 2022 and 23 will grow in fiscal 2025 through 2027, but at a slower pace than what we have had historically. This reflects a return to more typical economic conditions and the ongoing reaction of consumers and businesses to higher interest rates aimed at easing and controlling inflation. At the same time, however, I would emphasize that our sales tax base is significantly higher than it was 10 years ago. When I became controller, sales tax collections were less than $29 billion. In fiscal 2025, they are an estimated $48.8 billion. Even moderate growth on bigger base is substantial. About 88% of total general revenue-related funds for 2026-27 is projected to come from tax revenues. The sales tax is our revenue system's mainstay. It has made up more than half of the annual state general revenue-related tax collections since 1988. The next largest source of general revenue in 2026-27 are projected to be motor vehicle sales and rental taxes, all production taxes, franchise tax, and insurance taxes. Notably, the increase in insurance tax collections affects the important issue of housing affordability, which my office examined last year. Insurance tax collections, after growing at an annual average rate of 4.8% from 2015 through 2021, jumped by 15.6% in 2022, and by a further 30.2% in 2023. This increase was caused by factors including higher auto and home repair costs, a rise in both the prevalence and severity of natural disasters, and stronger overall economic activity. I expect the growth rate of all insurance tax revenue, including premium taxes, to slow over the next biennium, with collections reaching $9.2 billion, 10.5% more than in 2024-25. Insurance is just one small part of our economy, but it's an important one, and a key aspect of the bigger picture. Texas benefits from being a magnet for businesses looking to expand and citizens seeking a better way of life, but we must ensure people can afford the cost of living here. Nowadays, some homeowners are paying as much every month for their home insurance and property taxes as they are for their mortgage. Oil and natural gas tax collections are the product of two factors, price and production. The price of oil has fluctuated wildly over the past 20 years, and historically, there also are swings in natural gas prices. Oil production, meanwhile, has experienced a significant change that also affects other parts of our economy. It is no longer tightly tied to rig count. Horizontal drilling and improved fracking techniques now allow companies to produce more oil with fewer rigs. From fiscal 2014 through 2024, the number of active rigs decreased by 65%. Yet oil production increased by 92% during that time period. This makes oil production more efficient. It also has a ripple effect on sales tax collections from and employment in the mining sector. With fewer rigs, there is a drop in hiring and the purchases of taxable equipment and other goods related to well development. Looking at severance tax collections, Oil prices in 2025 are projected to average $70 a barrel, then rise to $71 in 2026 and $76 in 2027. Tax revenues will be around $11.8 billion in both the current and the upcoming biennium. Natural gas prices in 2026-27 biennium will slightly rebound based on an increase in power demand for artificial intelligence, data centers, and cryptocurrency mining, along with continuing rise in LNG demand. I project natural gas tax collections in 2026-27 will grow 25.5% to $5.35 billion. An oil price decrease and a recession in the 1980s helped fuel the creation of the state's Rainy Day Fund, formerly known as the Economic Stabilization Fund. It's funded by a portion of severance tax revenue and receives half of any unencumbered and unobligated general revenue balances at the end of the biennium. The ESF helps keep the state on stable financial footing and positively affects our credit rating, although I doubt anyone in 1988 envisioned its balance would grow to be more than $28 billion, as I project it will be by the end of 2026-27 biennium, absent any additional appropriations. That number will be even higher if not for a constitutional provision that caps the ESF balance at an amount equal to 10% of general revenue deposited during the previous biennium. The Rainy Day Fund will hit its cap at the beginning of fiscal 2026 with the partial transfer of 2025 severance tax revenue, reducing the amount of money to be transferred and preventing any additional transfers to the fund in fiscal 2027 and 2028. The Rainy Day Fund will likely continue hitting the cap in future years, requiring a policy decision. Should severance taxes remain in general revenue from here forward, or should they continue to go into the ESF? If the latter, a constitutional amendment would be required to raise the ESF cap. This chart assumes no further severance tax transfers into the Rainy Day Fund due to the constitutional cap in comparison to the balance if the transfers were to continue. Interest income on the ESF cash balance will also start flowing to the General Revenue Fund starting in fiscal 2026 when the cap is reached. Despite the halt on transfers and interest income, the total ESF balance is projected to grow due to investment income on the invested portion of the fund. This is a result of changes that I pushed for and that lawmakers approved to invest the ESF in a prudent way that maintains its purchasing power and liquidity while keeping only 10% of the fund balance in cash or its equivalents. Before this change, we were required to manage the Rainy Day Fund in a way that basically amounted to burying the money in the Capitol lawn. The Rainy Day Fund can be tapped with a supermajority vote of the legislature. The BRE limits how much the legislature can appropriate through 2027 because lawmakers cannot spend more revenue than is projected to be available. We call this the pay-as-you-go limit. Additional spending limits are set in the Texas Constitution and state law, and all of the legislative actions should be within all of the limits. In Article 8, Section 22, our Constitution specifies that the rate of growth of appropriations from state tax revenues that aren't constitutionally dedicated cannot exceed the rate of growth of the state economy unless a majority of the legislature agrees. State law limits growth in appropriations of consolidated general revenue to the rate of growth in combined population and inflation, except for tax relief or disaster recovery. This includes appropriations from the General Revenue Fund, General Revenue Dedicated Funds, and General Revenue Related Funds. Exceeding this cap would require a 3/5 vote of the legislature saying an emergency requires it. Overall, my forecast assumes continued slowing inflation along with moderate economic growth in 2025 and in the coming biennium. I expect population growth to average 1.2% per year in 2026-27, lower than in recent years but higher than what is expected in the U.S. average of 0.6%. In current dollar terms, our gross state product is expected to increase by an average of 4.5% annually, and personal income will also grow. Employment growth will continue, but it also will slow appreciably. Again, my estimate is tempered by uncertainty. The BRE cannot incorporate the possible effects of unanticipated national and global events that could affect economic growth and revenue collections in Texas. Potential economic disruption could come from weather-related disasters, the continued wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, China's economic activities, changes in federal policies, and the possibility of a return to higher inflation and a very restrictive policy by the Federal Reserve to combat it. And the only certainty with regard to oil and gas prices is that they are volatile. Because of all of these factors, my estimate, while positive, is conservative. Absent an economic crisis, however, I project our economy will continue to normalize after the profound disruptions of the pandemic, the dramatic recovery when COVID restrictions were lifted, and high inflation that accompanied a booming economic growth. Despite the uncertainty surrounding some proposals of the new administration, business leaders are also expressing optimism at the prospect of less regulation. I owe it to state leaders, lawmakers, and the people of Texas to carefully assess the changing economic situation and to keep you informed about any developments that affect these projections. I stand ready with the talented professionals in my office to work with lawmakers who are making major spending decisions. As always, we are committed to doing our very best for the Texans who depend on us. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Comptroller Hegar. Thank you very much to all of our attendees today. My name is Chris Bryan. I am the Director of Communications and Information Services here at the Comptroller's Office. I appreciate you're all bearing with us. We had a few little sound glitches here and there, but overall, it sounds like the information came across and the video feed played fairly well. Those of you who are attending today should feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature of the MS Teams live platform. If the Q&A feature is not already up on your screen right now, you can find that by clicking on the icon of the two small dialog boxes with the question marks in them in the upper right portion of your screen. As a note for our audience members, you are welcome to ask questions anonymously. We do ask as a courtesy from members of the press and legislative staff, if you wouldn't mind entering your name and affiliation in the Your Name field, and then just enter your question in the Ask a Question field. Myself and our other moderators will be posing those questions to the controller as time permits, but that allows us, we sometimes don't get to every question. That allows us to help follow up and make sure that we're able to run down any numbers that we didn't get to in today's presentation. Again, feel free to submit questions anonymously, but if you are a member of the press or a legislative staffer, it would be helpful for us if you would enter your name and affiliation. I believe Comptroller Hegar has had a chance to get a sip of water, and we have him coming live back on the screen now. I will say, for anyone who is looking for these materials, you can find them at controller.texas.gov/revenue-estimate. Comptroller Hegar, thank you so much for walking through this stuff with us today. We appreciate your being here. We've got some questions filtering in through the Q&A feature. Just a reminder, folks, please ask questions via that Q&A function, not via the chat function, just via the Q&A function. But as we're waiting for questions to kind of roll through, I had a couple of things that I wanted to kind of go back and make sure folks heard. One, to get us started, we have once again another large cash carry balance. Last time I remember you mentioned that was our historical levels were a once in a lifetime number. We have a little bit of deja vu, but it's a little bit different this time. Can you talk a little bit about what we've got now?
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. I appreciate that you're reminding me. I told everybody it was unprecedented, it was historical, and I made a big deal that this was a once in a lifetime. Yet here we are with another very large record carryover balance. But there's a distinct difference between last time and this time. Last time it was over 30 billion. Now it's over 20 billion. So there's a significant difference between the two. Secondly, last time it was from three factors. One, the state economy, like the national economy coming out of COVID, had significant revenues into state treasuries because people were spending large amounts of money on a variety of things. Secondly, it was 40-year record high inflation. So if you paid more for an item, you paid that equal amount in sales tax and it ended up being more in the treasury. And then lastly, thirdly, it was a significant amount of federal money that was poured into state and local governments, right, wrong, or indifferent. Now, a lot of this is principally, while the economy of Texas has continued to grow, a lot of this cash carryover balance is really prudent decisions by the legislature last session to do one-time expenses, not spend all the dollars, to be cautious, make sure where the direction of the state economy is going. So there's come from two different reasons of why we are here again at a large cash carryover balance, though fundamentally different from 2 years ago.
Thank you. Yeah, and that goes to one of the questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A. Amanda from Bloomberg asked just to clarify that the issue is not with tax collections being weak or overall economic weakness, revenue declines, but rather some of the issues that you discussed. She mentions a lower surplus to start the biennium.
Absolutely. Great question. I'm glad she asked for that clarification. The fact is, Texas economy continues to grow. We have people continuing to move to Texas every day. We have businesses relocating, expanding in Texas. So our economy continues to grow, though projected at a more moderate rate in the next 2 years than what we have seen in the last few years. But we see Texas economy is going to continue to grow. The slight decrease in available funds available and cash carryover balance is really from the reduction of that cash carryover balance from 2 years ago. Also, a slight reduction in natural gas severance tax collections because the price of natural gas is lower today than what it was a couple of years ago. And then lastly, we also have lower amounts of federal funds coming in the state treasury than we did 2 years ago. So therefore, that slight decrease in overall funds available this session compared to last session. But again, a large cash carryover balance.
Indeed. Thank you for that question, Amanda. John Moritz from the Austin American-Statesman just wants asking a clarifying question as well. And it's something that we kind of grapple with because we've got the budget cycle happening as the legislature convenes, but we also have a supplemental budget to finish out the current biennium. So John asks, are you projecting a surplus at the end of the coming budget cycle, or does that depend on ledge appropriations? And I think we know the answer, but
yeah, very, very good question. Currently, this is not taking in account any supplemental appropriation. So if the legislature has a supplemental appropriation, however, with that being said, I think it is very fair to rest assured we're going to continue to have a large cash carryover balance in general revenue at the end of this 2-year budget cycle that ends in August of this year and start the new fiscal year. And then secondly, we're going to continue to have a large amount of money that's in our economic stabilization fund in both.
Well, since you brought up the Economic Stabilization Fund, maybe we can give the audience a little bit of clarification. We are currently sitting at approximately $24 billion in the rainy day fund, but you are projecting that to grow. But this time next year, we'll be hitting a cap on that. Is that correct?
Yes. That is correct. So thankfully, the legislature in the last couple of legislative sessions, when I first got here, that fund balance had a little over $6 billion. Now, as you accurately note, that it is almost $24 billion, an increase significantly over the course of the last 10 years, even though a portion of the severance taxes that used to go in the ESF are rightly dedicated to transportation funding to keep the Texas economy moving. But a large percentage, we have an increase in investment earnings compared to where we were years ago because the legislature has given us the tools. I asked for the tools to allow us to do more than bury the ESF on the Capitol lawn. As we know, it wasn't really there, but it was an analogy to make a point that we had to keep it in the Treasury pool and we couldn't earn the purchasing power for adjusting for inflation. And so the legislature gave us those tools. Now, because of the ability here at the agency and the trust company, we are earning a little over $1 billion each year to continue to add to the ESF balance. So it'll continue to grow even though we are hitting the constitutional cap as a percent of the ESF in relation to revenues coming into the state treasury. And so therefore those severance taxes will not continue to go into the ESF, the Economic Stabilization Fund, going forward. However, the fund will continue to grow because of those investment earnings, assuming the legislature this session, next session, but at some point they will use money out of the Economic Stabilization Fund for either an economic downturn, whenever that may happen, or for one-time expenses that they have historically in the past for infrastructure funding, for example.
Thank you, Controller. We did have a couple of questions on, I'm trying to work through Vance Ginn at Ginn Economic Consulting has a number of questions. I think they are generally going to be policy-related questions. Vance says, given the projected decline in GRR, should the Texas legislature be ready to make some spending cuts? I think we covered that to some extent. Then he asks about some policy decisions based on the constitutional cap of the ESF and the possibility of reducing severance taxes to help oil and gas be more competitive. All of those kind of relate to some extent to the balances in the ESF as well as the sort of projected cash carry balance. Now, do you have any thoughts on sort of where you would like to see the legislature go? Are you concerned at all about them making spending decisions? I know you talked a little bit about the fact that conservative budgeting is what gave us this cash carry balance.
Well, first, I'll say I've never known Vince for not asking policy questions. So I'd be disappointed if he did not at least give several in the Q&A. So proud of him for that. Secondly, the fact is, I think the legislature will look at a wide range of things, whether it has been discussed in the past of whether severance taxes should continue to go in the ESF, whether they should go in transportation, whether there should be tax cuts for the oil and gas industry. Those policy discussions will happen. Obviously, whether there is some type of tax relief, whether that is in franchise tax, a state tax, or whether it's in a non-state tax, one that we don't collect because constitutionally prohibits. However, property taxes are always a continued discussion. And so therefore, I think, those types of things will be discussed. The legislature typically has and will continue to. And then what is the funding decisions going forward with the state of Texas continuing to grow at a very large rate in the state? And so what are those infrastructure funding needs? Obviously, the legislature made very prudent decisions a few sessions ago in trying to make sure that we tackled potential pension issues in the state of Texas. So those are no longer issues, and I'm very thankful that they made those decisions. So I think we'll continue to look at 2-year budgeting, but also further out on the horizon is what is the direction we need to do, both in fiscal discipline and also responsible expenses in the government to keep the Texas economy moving in the right direction.
Thank you, sir. Our next question, we've got a couple of related questions here. I'm going to kind of tie them together. Brad Johnson of the Texan asks, what are the largest items of spending left over from the last session that sort of remain unspent or that you anticipate potentially needing to be spent? On a sort of related note, Donna Howard asks, your cover letter indicates TDCJ is using $6.6 billion in federal COVID dollars. Is that included in the $23.76 billion ending balance? So kind of similar questions. We are dealing with the numbers. We are not necessarily dealing with what actions were taken at the end of last session. But those are included in how we make these calculations, yes?
Yeah, yes, that is correct. That is absolutely correct. We take all those things into factor, both the current budget cycle as well as decisions going forward. Say, for example, with the COVID dollars that are left over, as to Donna's question and Brad's question, that is the biggest piece, that those dollars have to be expended. One of the eligible items is spending them on in TDCJ and in salaries, for example. There was a little bit more there available than we had anticipated when we began this process of establishing the BRE, and recently governor's instructions, Texas Department of Criminal Justice, so therefore that increased our available cash carryover balance in GR, because now that freed up GR because those dollars remaining of COVID relief funds are being spent over there, of course, throughout this fiscal year. So the important part is we have to take all those things into account, and they come in at the end of the day of the total number as well as the individual pieces to make the overall budget work.
we've got a couple of folks. There's a couple of anonymous questions, but I see it repeated a few times here in our Q&A area, which is sort of given the increases in revenue, the high balances that we have, should the legislature be working on how to give that money back to Texans? I know you've talked about whether we can afford property tax, additional property tax cuts, things like that. But I think that question sort of encompasses a number of different versions of it, which is that we've got big balances. Should that money, some of that, go back to Texas taxpayers?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the legislature and has in the last several sessions always taken into account that balancing of that need, that these revenues, they come from who? The taxpayer. All these dollars are taxpayer dollars, whether they are tax dollars, whether they're investment earning dollars. At the end of the day, they're always taxpayers. So how do you take that angle and that look? And so therefore, the point being is trying to make sure that you balance that. You're giving tax relief to those people, put money back in their pockets so they can spend the dollars as they want to, but also making sure that our roads are being built, our water infrastructure is being built, that our electric grid is continuing to be reliable, and making sure that we can use it every single day, broadband expansion capabilities, because we wouldn't be able to talk to each other without that opportunity here. So the legislature has continued to make sure they balance each one of those and make sure to provide some type of relief regardless in all of those situations.
Sort of on a related note, I'm going to jump around a little bit in our Q&A. We do have a question from Dave Montgomery. There are a couple of similar questions. There's likely to be a push for another substantial reduction in property taxes, with some even calling for their elimination. Will our revenue picture comfortably accommodate an additional reduction in property taxes? I think you talked a little bit about that, but I think there's some other related things people are asking about, whether we can afford some of the cuts that were made last time around. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the more important points to make out of all this, and this is one that I made 2 years ago as well, even though it's substantially different of how we got here and where we're at today with the revenues. But the point being is still the fact remains, no matter what, we have to always continue to balance what is the short-term and the long-term trend of the state of Texas and where we're continuing to go as a growing economy. And so with that being said, I think you always have to balance all of those issues. And normal, when I was in the legislature, you had to tackle one major issue at a time. You couldn't tackle two or three. 2 years ago, the legislature could provide record property tax relief, could also tackle many one-time issues that had not been tackled before, and they can do that the same. Now, it's the old the old saying that you can't swallow the whole apple at once, but you can take a significant bite out of it. And so with this current situation that we're in, the legislature can take pretty significant bites out of several major issues, but it's hard to swallow one at one time. And so therefore, I think that's the lens that we always have to look at this through, is how do we make sure that we are attacking those major infrastructure issues that I talked about, whether it's tax relief, whether it is also affordability of housing, which we talk about pretty significantly, and I have through this office, because that has been a significant contributor to the Texas economy as being more affordable, but we're not as affordable as we used to be, and not just in certain metropolitan areas, but much more so across the entire state of Texas than we used to be. And so therefore, the point being is not lose sight of trying to tackle several different of these issues at one time. And the legislature actually can do that this session with the tools at their disposal.
I had a clarifying question here, going back to the ESF. Megan from the Houston Chronicle asks, could the legislature make an appropriation from the rainy day fund this session to avoid the fund meeting its cap, or is that outcome already sort of baked into this estimate?
Yeah, the legislature can make an appropriation. There are certain items that they can appropriate. Well, for a supermajority vote in the House and the Senate, they can appropriate. That's what requires appropriation out of the ESF. Then the question becomes, not to get too much in the weeds, but then do those dollars count against their spending cap and what they can spend under the next budget? There's a couple of scenarios where they don't have to take that into account. And so therefore, it kind of depends. It's a little bit messier than yes or no question. But in theory, the answer is yes. It's just whether in the details of all the different pieces that they have to in passing a budget, whether that actually could actually happen.
And sticking with the ESF, I think there's a lot of interest in the ESF. We have
Yeah.
a UTSA student who has asked how our office manages the ESF. And on a related question, we have an anonymous question asking, would it be possible, given the level of the ESF balance, to sort of create an endowment structure whereby the revenues from that could pay down property taxes or provide additional property tax relief?
So first, I'm super excited that a college student is actually watching the presentation on the revenue estimate. And if you're doing this for a class, tell your teacher you should get an A, even though no semester just started this week. So that's awesome. Secondly, yes, the legislature can we create several different types of endowments that have been for different purposes. But I think the bigger question is the ESF was originally designed to weather an economic downturn. Now, we're not forecasting a recession in this revenue estimate, but at some point in time, there will be something globally, we don't know when, we don't know what, that will cause the next downturn in the economy. And so therefore, the question becomes, from a policy decision, the legislature has given us more tools in the toolbox to make sure that we can earn those dollars on the ESF. Here in the agency, we have what's called the Texas Safekeeping Trust Company, which manages the Treasury pool, as well as the Economic Stabilization Fund, as well as several different endowments that have been entrusted to this office. So the trust company is responsible for managing. We have a group of whole lot of different advisors that work with us on managing those dollars on behalf of the people of the state of Texas. So that's a short version of where the responsibility of managing those dollars are at. But the point being is the legislature can make different decisions. That's up to them from policy decisions. However, whatever the decisions make, we will stand up, we will implement going forward.
Thank you, sir. A couple of folks have asked, and it's an interesting time to be delivering the revenue estimate. We've got a change in administration at the federal level. We talk a lot about federal policy, how it impacts Texas. Texas, you've talked about Texas is the 8th largest economy in the world. We've talked about Texas being the top state for international trade in the nation. So obviously our economic well-being is tied to sort of the global economic conditions, and it is also tied to federal policy. We have a couple of different questions. I'll start with tariffs. We have a couple folks in the Q&A asking whether you are concerned about tariffs and their impact on Texas revenues.
Yeah, so great question. That's been a topic of conversation for several people. And leading up to every administrative change, there's always a significant number of questions that come about. The promises being made, can this Congress, can this administration, the incoming administration, effectively make a change on whatever policy it is? And so therefore, it usually brings lots of discussion on those particular issues. Obviously, Texas, as I have noted, is very tied to the international economy. Even though we are 9% roughly of the entire U.S. economy, we export well over 20% of the entire value of product out of the entire nation, more than double what our contribution is to the national economy. So we are very tied to the global economy. It's extremely important. What comes into our ports of entry, whether it's by water, by land, by air, significant economic impact going out and coming in to this state, contributing to the state economy and contributing to the national economy. So any change in potential tariffs can bring ripple effects. However, with that being said, I think it's always important, and it kind of reminds me of the time back in COVID, where, say, for example, immediately no one knew exactly what was going to happen, what was the trajectory of the economy. And so I think, we always kind of have to take a very methodical approach. And when you have a change in administration, those things don't happen literally overnight. They're implemented over the course of the time. So my point being is, with that, it's something that we monitor, we watch, we take into account, yet there's not going to be a flip of the switch overnight. So it'll take a little while to implement whatever that is, and we'll continue to be monitoring, we'll continue to watch it, and we'll definitely update the legislature and the public as how we think it may impact the economy when we see whatever that will be.
Absolutely. And that's a reminder. There's a couple of questions on federal dollars, federal policy. A good general reminder that the folks in revenue estimating, as you are discussing the decisions regarding the revenue estimate, we typically do not count our chickens before they're hatched, so to
No.
speak. If the money is not there or is not, there is not a mechanism in place for it to come through, we don't typically count that money. We don't try to anticipate future policy decisions. We sort of provide a lay of the land, so to speak, and what we anticipate coming based on current conditions. So as you are saying,
That's right. So regardless of whether it is potential funding program on the federal level, say, for example, a large piece with the broadband dollars, for example, which is here in this office with the Texas Broadband Office, those dollars until Congress passes them and we know the president signs them, then we're not going to take into account those amounts of dollars coming to the state of Texas. So same with dollars coming in, potential changes that could be in either federal funding and or policies that could impact the state economy until they're implemented. It's not in a good habit because you would be playing lots of guessing games, and it's better to make assumptions based on what the law is, not what you think it may or may not be. We have enough work. We have enough work to do without trying all the guessing games.
That goes to another question that we sort of were looking at. We have seen the legislature has made significant investments in border security. The 24-25 General Appropriations Act had north of $6.5 billion in border funding. There are some questions about whether if the federal policy shifts on that, whether lawmakers would be able to reduce spending on border security if the federal government steps in and assumes some of those responsibilities that Texas has been paying for. But again, that's not in this revenue estimate. Is that right?
That's right. That's not in this revenue estimate, even though I personally would assume that with the change in administration, we wouldn't have to spend quite the same dollars in border security that we have in the current 2-year budget. But with that being said, the legislature coming in tomorrow, the new administration coming in soon, the legislature has a little bit of time in structuring this budget on exactly what the current administration plans to do.
We have a question from James Labaugh on a very specific text. Cigarette tax collections seem to be phasing themselves in slow motion. I think he's saying phasing themselves out in slow motion. Is this a good thing or a bad thing for Texas?
Well,
and I have sort of a follow-up, which is that your office, we've been dealing with some changes in how cigarettes and cigarette taxes are not collected, but how they're sort of applied. So, good thing or bad thing for cigarette tax collections going down?
Yeah, I think it's an important question and an interesting one. Labaugh is never short of questions to some degree as a former revenue estimator over here. But the fact is, while it may impact the state treasury as usage goes down and or shifting to other products, the fact is from a health standpoint and say for a healthcare side, that expenditure side goes down. So it's not just one single end to the state treasury. It also means there may not be other expenditures, but you are correct, Chris, that as products change, whether it is a tobacco product may be a bigger question than whether it is a cigarette. And so there are non-cigarette type items that still have tax applied to them, and those revenues continue to come in the treasury.
One of the things that folks may not know about your duties is you meet with the credit ratings firms and you talk with them about the state of the Texas economy, what you see going forward, and provide them with the information that they use to decide what our credit rating is. And our credit rating is basically a signal out there to markets about whether these firms believe that Texas is a good investment. Can you talk a little bit about that process and then whether you believe that they are getting things right and whether Texas is a good investment?
Yeah, it's an interesting process. We talk to 4 different credit rating firms every single year. That's kind of been a practice under this administration. And one of the things is we provide them with our upcoming cash flow forecast for each new fiscal year. We have that discussion from a credit rating standpoint, those years, which has been a while since we've had to go out to the market to borrow short-term financing. Principally, why does the state do that? is because come September 1, October, November, the state of Texas has had a policy for a very long time to front load the school districts 50% of the state share of funding in the school finance formulas in the first quarter of a fiscal year. So typically that means a cash flow shortfall for the state of Texas certain days of the month subsequently. And so we haven't had to borrow money in the last few years, obviously with large cash carryover balances. But with that being said, those discussions come about. Where do we see not just the cash flow of the state of Texas next year, but where do we think the economy is going? What are the indicators that we see? So it's a wide range of different questions. Then you never know what the questions are going to be, but principally, does Texas continue to engage in conservative budgeting practices? Do we have the tools in the toolbox to adjust whenever that next recession is going to happen? What are our cash balances? What are the spending practices? What does leadership want to do? And typically, one of the things that we can continue to say over and over, that Texas as a state continues to grow at a larger percent of our GDP than that of the nation. We're continue to be a net magnet for people to move to the state of Texas. We continue to grow 1,200 people a day, half of that in natural growth, half of that people moving here. But the point being, Texas continues to be an economic engine. And as I've liked to note, in the last decade, if I was doing this 10 years ago on my first revenue estimate, we were the 12th largest economy. And now in a short 10 years, we've moved to be the 8th largest economy. That is pretty phenomenal for the state of Texas in economic growth.
It is. That's an amazing statistic, and tremendous growth, and a testament to the overall leadership in the state of Texas, especially during some very challenging economic conditions. You talked about the ratings firms. One of the things that you also talk about in conjunction with the ratings firms' assessment of Texas's sort of fiscal health is housing affordability. Right. You've been asked whether that's an issue that concerns you, whether it's key to the Texas miracle. You've talked a little bit about property taxes. While insurance companies pay insurance taxes, they do pass those costs on to ratepayers, as you've noted. So can you talk a little bit about housing affordability, how that plays into our credit rating, our overall economic health, and what you see going forward on that front?
Yeah, great question. One of the things that we have typically talked about in those credit rating meetings is that Texas is more affordable than most other states. Those economies that we compare ourselves to out of the other 49 states in the nation, or even other countries around the world. However, over the last several years, and principally after COVID, with the amount of people that were wanting to buy different real estate, the real estate market increasing. And so part of that discussion used to be, well, we're more affordable. Then we say, well, more affordable than, say, for example, here in Austin or the Metroplex, certain suburban areas of the state. But then after a few years ago, that pretty much started applying across much of the state of Texas. And seeing that trend is more of a concern for me. And that's why we did the housing affordability report earlier last year, I should say, last year, midsummer, is because I wanted to at least highlight that issue to the legislature, that this is a concern going forward. This is a topic and issue that is extremely important to the health of this economy. And if we don't want to see a repeat in Texas of some other states where housing affordability, whether it's single family, multifamily, then we need to look at all the array of options and start figuring out. And a piece of it today, more than ever before, with record high 40-year inflation over the course of the last several years, is now people are paying significantly higher amounts in their premiums in both auto as well as in housing. And so therefore in their insurance. And one of those contributing factors is everything just costs substantially more. And so now today is really one of the first times that you see people paying more in what? Their interest rates, as well as in their mortgage when it comes to home insurance. And so those two pieces are bigger. And so that's a concern. And it's something that I felt like was extremely important to elevate to the legislature as they grapple with the policy decisions this session.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We've got a couple of questions related to the so-called surplus. We don't typically use the word surplus in the office, but I think that it's a reasonably good assessment of what we have. We usually use the cash carry balance term, but we do have close to a $24 billion surplus, $23.8 billion surplus cash carry balance. And then we do have a question. I know you covered this a little bit, but you mentioned contingent education dollars in that amount. And we have questions about whether, because education savings account or school choice seems to be a priority issue for this legislature, can they afford that? And that $4.5 billion or so that is a part of that $23.8 billion. That is money that we count as not yet spent, right? Because similar to the way we talk about federal money, we're not going to count their chickens before they're hatched, so to speak, right?
Yeah. So essentially, the legislature last session had appropriated in the current budget around $4.5 billion, if I recall, for public education. However, the enacting legislation did not pass. And so once we went through regular sessions, special sessions, got far enough, it seemed pretty evident that those dollars will not be implemented. And even if they were in a kind of emergency item, they won't be able to put into place in the current budgets of school districts. And so therefore, that is part of that $23 billion. So that almost $24 billion includes that. As we go through this legislative session, I do believe public education is going to be a significant discussion. I think education savings accounts is going to be a significant discussion. I don't know exactly where the legislature is going to land on both of those, but I do think they will probably pass something. And I do think that the budget will take that into account. And I think we can afford whatever the legislature decides. Again, that piece as well as the other pieces put into place, all taken in totality, that we will have a sound budget and one that balances.
I just want to remind folks, if you do have a question, we are coming to the end of our time. We've just got a time for a few more questions for Comptroller Hegar. If you still have a question left, please remember to use the Q&A feature. That's the question marks in the dialog boxes up sort of in the top right hand of your screen there. Comptroller Hegar, we just saw a holiday shopping season that had record online sales. Can you just sort of remind us about how Texas is treating online sales, some of the work that your office has done? And I know there's some pretty eye-popping numbers. I think since inception, we've seen,
I'll answer it for you. Yeah, pretty phenomenal. Whenever the U.S. Supreme Court made the decision in the Wayfair court decision, and I went to the legislature and proposed to them a couple implementations of that to make sure that the law was very consistent, everyone knew what it was, make sure those marketplace providers as well as online remote sellers understood what the law was, so therefore those dollars are being collected. The first year, if I recall, the first 12 months, it brought in about $1.6 billion. Now, fast forward 5 years later, that ends up being almost $4 billion, $3.8 billion. And so in the last 5 years, that's $14 billion in online sales. And again, the whole concept is making sure that if you and I walked into a local store in our community and we paid sales tax, it was being equally attributed to those online sellers who may or may not even be in the state of Texas. They may be located somewhere else. And so it was really about parity and making sure that there was an equal playing field out there, regardless of whether it was an on-site or whether it was an online seller. And in fact, now online sales is roughly about 20% of all sales tax collections, yet that gets a little murky and sometimes, because if it's a pure online or a remote seller, that's classified as an online. If they have both online and a premise, those are just remitted as from that retailer, for example, but we don't see the breakdown between the two. So the point being is it's actually even a larger percent that's online than what's actually being reported. I just
I
know
did
in
want-
my household with with a 19-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 17-year-old, almost 17, 17, and 20. Let me just say around Christmas time, yeah, we get a lot of packages at our door too. So you're not the only one.
But sounds like you might also be really feeling the pinch of that increase in insurance rates and revenues there.
Yeah, well, we don't have enough time left in this discussion to talk about that issue.
Well, we've got time for just one more question here. I know that there are still a few questions that remain unanswered. We'll talk a little bit about that, and we will endeavor to get those questions answered and follow up with folks. I would be remiss though. You've talked about the challenges of estimating revenues for a biennium that does not start, as a reminder, until September 1st, 2025. So we've got September 1st, 2025 is when this starts, and then it goes for 24 months after that. So there's got to be a lot of big uncertainties out there. We've talked about the price of oil. We've talked about some of the things that people remember. What are the things that concern you? I know price of oil from your first revenue estimate keeps you up at night, but what are some of the things that are concerned about and that provide some uncertainty out there?
Yeah, there again, just the fact that Texas economy is tied to the global economy. So things that happen around the rest of the world can either have a push or a drag effect on this state economy. And so therefore, whether it is unfortunate wars across, we can name a few here in the world right now that are having devastating effects in those regions, and they have a ripple effect into the economy and how it impacts, whether it was the drastic COVID restrictions. Of course, hopefully we will never have anything like that ever again, and what that threw into the economy, whether it is a global recession, whether it is a famine in some part of the world, regime change, tariffs. We can go off on a whole lot of different things, but the fact is we have to take the data that we have in front of us, looking at where the economy has been in the last few years and where we think it's going to grow. Well, I think the Texas economy is going to continue to grow, but more modestly. But that is also the reason that I have pledged since day one, and for the last several years, continuing, is the fact is, as we see the data change, as we see the numbers change, we're going to make sure to tell the legislature and tell the public, and we will make updates when necessary to make sure that they know what we know, that there is a change in the economy, either to the positive or, unfortunately, if there will be one day, to the negative.
Thank you, Comptroller Hegar. I'm gonna bring an end to our discussion today. Thank you for taking the time to walk through all that with us. I know there are a couple of questions that remain unanswered. John from TPPF, I will get that housing affordability report to you so that you have that information. There are a couple of questions that I know that we have covered today, which is a good reminder that the entirety of this presentation will be available online at controller.texas.gov/revenue-estimate. All the materials, as well as the entire revenue estimate with all the useful information, including where we see oil prices going, where we see GDP and gross state product going, where we see interest rates going, that is all available at controller.texas.gov/revenue estimate. We will have the entire presentation as well as the Q&A portion available later on in the evening as soon as we have a little bit of time to clean this up. If you do have questions that you have not had a chance to answer, we have some contact information up on your screen right now. Email them to communications.contacts@cpa.texas.gov. That's communications.contacts@cpa.texas.gov. We really appreciate the comments we're getting. Thank you all for being here today. We're going to try to run down. I see there are still some questions in the Q&A that have not been answered. We are going to try to run down those numbers for you all. There's a couple that are quite detailed. We will work on getting those to y'all. We've got another question for the housing affordability report. We'll get that to you. Again, controller.texas.gov/revenue-estimate. Thank you to all the Controller's Office staff who made this presentation possible today. I especially want to thank the revenue estimating staff. some folks in IT, some folks in communications and information services, ledge affairs. Revenue estimating starts working on this at the end of, even before the end of the fiscal year, and we work on it right up until the morning that we put this out. So thank you for your hard work. And thank you again to Comptroller Hegar for being with us today. This concludes the January 13th Biennial Revenue Estimate. Thank you so much for being here.